Welcome back to another episode of Eerie Excursions, the podcast that takes the road less travelled and a left turn into the shadows with me, Amy, a history nerd who loves a good ghost story. Now, I'm no expert, so along our eerie adventure, we'll meet local guides who know all about the spooky legends lurking in their back garden. And watch out, because we might just be down the road from where you are right now. For today's trip, we're in the popular seaside town of Scarborough.
There have been many shipwrecks on this coastline. It is very rugged, rocky coastline. And when there are shipwrecks, there are, of course, lost souls. And these poor, unfortunate sailors would often wash up on the shore. Many of them would not be local, so what do you do with these bodies? Well, you have to put them in a makeshift morgue until further arrangements can be made for their burial. One such makeshift morgue is, you've guessed it, the Three Mariners Inn.
You ready to delve into the darkness? For decades, people have travelled from near and far to Scarborough for the arcades, beaches, and jaunty summer holidays. But today, we're going to peek behind the merriment and look at Scarborough's darker side. And to help us do that, we'll be taken around by our guide, Liah.
I'm Liah. I run Black Widow Tours. I am the Black Widow of Bar Street. I've lived in Scarborough a couple of years. I'm a historian. I love history and I love creepy things. So the two things together led me to running. Ghost tours isn't quite the right word. It's dark tales of murder, crime, and the paranormal. So it's a kind of mixture of everything.
Now, before we delve into the darker stories, Liah will tell us a bit about the history of Scarborough, because it's been so much more than just a seaside resort.
It was founded by Vikings over 1,000 years ago. It's got a long history. It's got a castle, which it is in ruins now, and that is because in the 17th century it got destroyed during the Civil War. So it wasn't because of it just didn't just fall down. It was actually sort of blown up, basically. But what you see today is what's left of it, because the town protested and requested to stop damaging it because they wanted to keep some remnants of it. But there's a long history up there. There's various kings have been there: Richard III, King John, King Stephen, all very far back in history. But yeah, it's the town has a surprisingly long and varied history. During the Civil War, for instance, it flipped hands 3 times. It went from royalist to parliamentarian, or the other way around, parliamentarian to royalist, and then flipped back the other way. It just kept switching sides. So that's why it got bombed. Scarborough is the first tourist beach resort in the country, and that's partly because of the beautiful beach on the South Bay in particular, although with the North Bay is very pretty as well, but it's mostly because of the spa. And that was because in 1626, a woman noticed that the water was turning the rocks brown in front of what is now the spa, and thought, I'm going to taste that. Yeah, exactly. Lucky for her, she didn't die, and in fact she found it beneficial to her health. And after that, tourism began. So right from the early 17th century, tourists, at least the really wealthy tourists, began to come to Scarborough. Curiously, the spa has been destroyed 3 times, one by an earthquake, one by a storm, and the last one by a fire. So the current one was opened in 1876. And the spa tourism really continued, particularly throughout the 19th century after the railways came and general tourism began. But unfortunately, in the 1960s, some people became unwell and they tested the water and found it had gone toxic. So the spa today doesn't have a spa. Ironically, it is still a theatre though. It was the largest music venue outside London when it was built in 1876. And it is still a theatre. It has 2 stages, so plus the Sun Court outside, where you can listen to nice music outside during the summer.
For our first stop, we step away from the busy seafront to a quiet street, Quay Street.
This is one of the oldest streets in Scarborough. It is a medieval street. If you've ever been to the Shambles in York, or if you haven't, Google it. You can imagine what this street would have looked like in days gone by. Very narrow, enclosed buildings, quite tall, dark. But today, obviously, you can see that one side of it is now 20th century buildings and others have been replaced in the 19th century. But the building just behind us here is the Three Mariners Inn, and that is the oldest still standing structure in the entire town. It's a Grade 2 listed medieval building. The facade was updated in the 17th century, and if you look around the side of the building, you can see the original medieval beams. The bar, incidentally, is still in the building, although today it is a living room. The Three Mariners Inn was one of the first licensed properties in Scarborough. It remained an inn until the early 20th century, after which there was a change in the law and it was forced to close. It became a museum, and then around 25 years ago, it was sold into private hands, and the couple that lived there live happily and peacefully with whatever else lingers inside. The Three Mariners Inn is an icon of Scarborough, partly because there is a long history of smuggling and privateering on the northeast coast. There are a number of tunnels that run from the harbour to various cottages and inns. One such inn is, of course, the Three Mariners. The tunnel runs straight into the cellar. There are secret passageways throughout the entire building. For stashing contraband, absolutely, but possibly also for hiding people. In the 16th and 17th century, it was illegal at various times to be Catholic in this country. And so families built priest holes, secret passages and cupboards into their homes in order to protect their family priest. The reason we believe these were used as priest holes is an additional cavity was discovered in the wall containing a 17th century French prayer book, a medieval bottle of holy water, alongside the accounts ledger for the sale of illegal tobacco. Priest, smuggler, not mutually exclusive. There were reputed to be an additional 26 cavities cut into this building. Some have been lost over the years. The current owners have only located 7. It is possible that some were destroyed when it was converted into a museum, but also the building originally stretched to the end of the street and incorporated what is now the back of the new Lancaster pub. So you can see there is now a hole in between the two buildings, so some of it has been lost over the years. If you'd like to look at the ground, you can see that there is this narrow strip up the middle of the road. These are called sets. They're not actually cobbles because of the design of them, but this is the original street, which is where you can compare it to the Shambles in York and how you can see just how narrow the street is. What is difficult to imagine, though, is just how dark it would have been in centuries gone by, before the invention of street lighting. I'd like you to imagine that this is the year 1792. You're a sailor. You've just arrived in the harbour in your tall wooden sailing ship. The sail is lowered, the anchor is dropped. Yourself and a companion lower a tender into the water. You climb down the rigging and you get into the little boat. It's piled high with contraband. You begin to row ashore. It's pitch black. It's the middle of winter and a sea mist is beginning to swirl around the boat. You can just make out the cliff to your right with the castle atop, occasionally peeking between the clouds. And you wonder if there's anyone up there, looking down, watching you. You arrive on the shore and you get out of the little boat. You drag it as close to the rocks as you dare to hide it from view, and you look for your signal. You can barely see your own hand in front of your face by now, but you can just make out a glimmer of a candle light flickering in the upper story of the Three Mariners. This is your signal. You begin to unload the goods onto the sand when a man appears through the mist, his winter cloak billowing out behind him, and you freeze. Is this the authorities come to arrest you and throw you in prison? Or a robber going to murder you and steal all your goods? But then the moonlight chinks through the cloud and catches on the man's face, and you recognise the ruddy complexion of the innkeeper from the Three Mariners. The three of you drag the goods through the tunnels and into the cellar of the Three Mariners. Now, your companion, he's never been here before, and he thinks, great, time for bed. But there is no rest for the wicked. You must hide all the goods. Behind paintings, tapestries, the Welsh dresser in the kitchen, beneath loose floorboards, until finally everything is put away. You kick off your shoes, it's 3 a.m, you sit by the fire, and the innkeeper cracks open a bottle of newly acquired and undeclared Scotch whisky, and he pours you a dram. When there's a sharp knock at the front door. Your instinct is to hide behind the bar, but the innkeeper calmly walks to the front door, and he looks out. But there's nobody there. You join him on the step, and you look up and down the street just in time to catch a glimpse of a headless woman disappearing into the mist. And then you breathe a sigh of relief, because this is the spirit of Elvira. She was a ship's figurehead that used to stand right here in front of the Three Mariners. Legend has it, her spirit manifests itself and comes to warn sailors of impending storms at sea. So you're going to go to bed tonight, and you're going to sleep well, and you're not going back to the ship until after the storm has passed. But many over the years have laughed it off as superstitious nonsense, only to come to a watery end soon after. Of course, there have been many shipwrecks on this coastline. It is very rugged, rocky coastline. And when there are shipwrecks, there are, of course, lost souls. And these poor, unfortunate sailors would often wash up on the shore. Many of them would not be local, so what do you do with these bodies? Well, you have to put them in a makeshift morgue until further arrangements can be made for their burial. One such makeshift morgue is, you've guessed it, the Three Mariners Inn. Bodies would be brought on planks and laid out in what was the bar area. Today it is a living room, so can you imagine? You live here, having a snack, watching telly of a night, look down at the ground and imagine the bodies that may once have been laid at your feet. You may also live here, and you up in the middle of the night and you think, I'm a bit thirsty. I'm going to pop down to the kitchen and grab a drink. Only on the stairs you come face to face with the spectre of a gnarly old sailor with ratty hair and a tatty beard, greedily guarding the contraband in the wall behind him. You may also wake up and hear arguing in the street outside. And when you come to investigate, there's nobody there. And yet, the arguing continues. You go outside to have a look, and you realise that the sound is coming from the corner of Dog and Duck Lane, just there. It is ominous, but you decide to go and have a look anyway. But when you get there, you see the spectre of a man looking down at the ground. You back away. You've been here before. You've seen it previously, but last time there was a spectre of two people, a couple, a man and a woman, arguing violently. It didn't end well for the woman. These are reputed to be a couple who, in the late 19th century, argued on that very corner of Dog and Duck Lane. The woman was attempting to leave her husband, but he wasn't having any of it. He pursued her to the corner of the steps, where he strangled her to death. Sadly, their names have been lost to time, but their spectres still remain as evidence of the crime. But not all ghosts are human. And the most famous ghost of Quay Street is that of the galloping horse and carriage. Sometimes seen, but most often heard, are the clattering hooves and rattling wheels as they hurtle up this old, narrow pathway. Perhaps the horse had been spooked, or the driver was in a hurry, but we can presume it came to some tragic, sticky end somewhere here on Quay Street. If you are lucky enough to catch a glimpse of this ethereal equine, you may just watch it rattle up the road and then disappear through the wall of a house that wasn't here when it was alive.
We leave the spectres of merchants, boats and horses behind as we head up the street along some busy main roads to Bar Street. Though it houses shops and has a hairdresser's, we arrive after everything is shut and the tourists have gone home, so it's nice and quiet for our next story.
So this is Bar Street. So named not for the number of drinking establishments, but because of the bar that reaches between the two buildings that you can see here. And this was a late 20th century reminder of what this street used to be. Scarborough was founded in the year 966 by Viking invaders. The original name for the town was Skartisborg. It morphed into Scarborough and eventually Scarborough over the years. As the town spread westward at the end of the 11th century, they built a defensive ditch around the new borough. By the end of that century, the burgess of Scarborough commissioned a further defensive wall to be built on the town side of that ditch, and that ran pretty much where this side of Bar Street is, across and over to the castle. The entrance to the town was right here at the top of Newborough Street, and it was marked by a gatehouse. It began life as a small wooden structure, but over the years it grew and was replaced and eventually became a brick arched gateway. And it was known as the Newborough Bar. Or to the prisoners who were kept there, because it also served as the town prison, the Black Hole. It had a terrible reputation. If you have a look on the wall behind you there, you can see a painting that is a mid-17th century depiction of what Bar Street looked like just before the English Civil War. During the war, they added cannons to the top, and then after the war, they were taken down again, and the Newborough Bar was continued to be used for prison for another 100 or so years. However, by the early 19th century, it had fallen into disrepair. And they decided to knock it down, move the prisoners to a more secure and sanitary location, and it was replaced by a grand arched neo-Gothic gateway. Where is it, I hear you ask? Well, they built it too narrow, and just 40 years after it was built, it was causing a massive bottleneck at the top of the town, and so in 1890 it was knocked down again. What you see today is pretty much what replaced it. So what of Bar Street itself? Well, there are rumours there was a plague pit under Bar Street. However, I've done quite a bit of research and I can find no evidence of any such plague pit. There was, however, a hospital on what is now the car park to the Grand Hotel. That hospital was built in the 11th century, and it was originally used as a leper colony, and during times of plague or pestilence, it was used as a pest house. There were bodies discovered in the grounds of that hospital, but as I say, that is much further down the cliff. Bar Street itself is very much probably today what it always was, for shopping. It was the entrance to the town. What better place to put up market stalls and sell refreshments and perhaps a smithy to reshoe your horses. The way it looks today is as it has done for the last 150 years. The bottom end of the street was constructed in the early 19th century, and many of the buildings on the left side of the street, as we can see it here, are listed buildings. It is quite a narrow street, as you can see, and it is quite unusual in its structure, which is perhaps why it has a slightly odd vibe to it. Well, the fact that it does look very much as it has done for the last 150 years is perhaps why much of the paranormal activity here on Bar Street are full body apparitions. Men, women and children, mostly in Victorian but some early 20th century attire, going about their daily business. Perhaps this is evidence of stone tape theory, where buildings record evidence of days gone by and then replay it under certain atmospheric conditions. Or perhaps Bar Street is some sort of time portal, and these people are going about their business, and they see us too, those ghosts. But there's a lot of paranormal activity in the buildings themselves. The business proprietors and the residents have reported the usual haunting things, pictures that won't stay on the walls, doors opening and closing of their own volition, footsteps in empty rooms. But then there's number 36. I had a lady on my tour a few months ago who told me that as a child, her grandparents owned number 36. Today it's a bookshop. Back then, she was frightened to stay there overnight. As a child, they used to stay here, but they were frightened to do so because when everyone was tucked up in bed, supposedly fast asleep, they would often hear the sound of footsteps on the ground floor, and sometimes furniture would be moved around. There's the hanged man at number 24. He swings from the rafters of the upper story. A medium has attempted to speak with him, but he doesn't respond, so perhaps he is just an echo of his own tragic past. But then there's Charlotte. She's a little girl, about 6 or 7 years old. She wears Victorian clothing and she likes to peek round corners before tentatively entering a room. She appears to be quite shy. She too used to live at number 24. However, the shop that used to be at 24, they were quite comfortable with her presence, and apparently Charlotte was quite comfortable with theirs, because when they moved to number 18, Charlotte moved with them. Apparently she likes to dance, particularly to Rihanna. And I have been informed that if you really want to draw her out of her shell, play Rude Boys, because that one's her favourite.
Do we know who she is?
No. We just know that that's her name because the lady that runs Hearts and Crafts, which is a shop that moved, she's a medium. So she speaks with her, but she doesn't know, she couldn't find out much about who she is, just that her name was Charlotte.
For our final stop, we cross the city and head to the Spa Bridge, which according to the National Transport Trust is a rare example of a multiple span cast iron bridge. It looms above a main road and looks out to the sea, whilst being watched on by Scarborough's castle.
So we're stopping here because, in my opinion, it is the second best view in Scarborough. The best view is from the top of South Cliff, and I'm not going to drag you up the hill. We are, however, going to look out over the view over South Bay. You can see the beautiful old town and the castle in the distance, and it is the castle that we're stopping here for in particular. And the castle mound has 3,000 years worth of history. The earliest archaeology goes to around 800 BCE. It was used as a Roman signalling station. There is evidence of Anglo-Saxon occupation, and as we already discussed earlier, the Vikings were here too, although there's little up on the mound to show for it. The castle itself began life in the 11th century as a royal manor house. In the early 12th century, King Stephen granted that royal manor house to William le Gros, along with the title the First Earl of York. William was delighted. He moved in. He loved Scarborough and he very much enjoyed living here, and he turned the manor house into a Norman-style castle. Unfortunately, when King Stephen died, his successor, Henry II, was a little less keen on other people living in royal properties, and so he requisitioned them, and poor William had to move out. This was quite useful for Henry's youngest son, the most infamous and disliked king in English history, King John. King John had a reputation for being particularly unpleasant. He had a very bad temper. He also liked to spend money. He purchased many properties. He expanded many more, including Scarborough Castle, which he expanded quite a lot and fortified. He also invested quite a bit in the town itself, which is perhaps why the Scarboroughians rather liked him, unlike most of the rest of the country. So King John also liked to fund wars. At that time, English territory included much of northern France, most of which he managed to lose. This did not make him very popular. When he ran out of his own money, he began to borrow from the other nobles. When they ran out of money, he added tax to the general landowning population. Thus, we have a little document you might recall from primary school history, the Magna Carta. Not that it really helped that much at the time, but nevertheless, there it is. Now, King John, realising he had a bit of a price on his head, decided to go somewhere he felt safe. And that, on at least 4 separate occasions, was Scarborough Castle. He's known to have stayed here for extended periods. So does King John's ghost lurk at Scarborough Castle? Perhaps you better go up there and have a look, see if you can find him. But the ghost that is reputed to lurk at Scarborough Castle is that of another particularly unpleasant man, and that is Piers Gaveston. He was born in the year 1284. He was, as a young man, he appeared quite amiable in he ingratiated himself to the king, Edward I, and Edward thought, what a nice young man, I'm going to place him in my son's household as a companion for the young prince. But to quote the records of the time, so extravagant were the prince's affections for young Piers that the king thought maybe it wasn't so great after all, and he sent him away. But lucky for the prince, the king died and the prince became the king. And as king, Edward II could do whatever he wanted. And one of the first things he did was bring Piers back to court. Now, this didn't go down very well. And this was not really about sexual preference. This was about political influence. Piers was the king's favourite. He had the king's ear. He could persuade the king to do whatever he wanted. And the king was apparently quite amiable. He persuaded Edward to give titles, land, and positions at court to his family members. I'd say friends, but he didn't really have that many other than the king himself. This, of course, really annoyed the other nobles. So they conspired to send him to Ireland. Off he went. But just as soon as the king could manage, he brought him back again. Now, you might imagine with 2 exiles under his belt, Piers would be a little bit nicer to people. No, sadly not. Instead, he started making up stories about the other nobles. He made up nicknames such as Burst Belly, the Fiddler, and the Black Dog of Arden. This, of course, did not go down well, and once more the nobles conspired to send Piers away. Had he stayed away, he may have grown to be a cantankerous old man somewhere else in the realm. But his third exile, much like his previous 2, was short-lived. Only this time, so was he. In 1312, he was brought back to court, and this time the king thought, perhaps I should send Piers somewhere he would be safe. And he chose Scarborough Castle. They'd had rendezvous up at Scarborough Castle on a couple of occasions, but perhaps he was taking influence from his ancestor, King John's inspiration. Scarborough Castle has only one land access point, the rest of it being surrounded by cliff. Therefore, it should be easy to defend. For King John, it was. For Piers, however, he was not so lucky, and the castle was in fact besieged. Piers was taken captive and removed to Oxford. So, did Piers die here? Is that why his ghost lurks at Scarborough Castle? Well, no. From Oxford, he was taken to Warwick, where he was run through with a sword by 2 Welshmen. Why the Welshness is important, why it took 2, who knows? But there it is in the history books. And then they snicked off his head. So, was he buried at Scarborough? Well, no. He's buried in Hertford. So, why on earth does Piers Gaveston's ghost lurk at Scarborough Castle? Perhaps you'd better go up there and ask him. Although I wouldn't recommend it. I would suggest if you do go up to the castle and you happen to see a headless man in medieval attire, you make a hasty retreat, because he is reputed to lurk on the ramparts, where he attempts to lure unsuspecting tourists onto the battlement and attempts to push them off. Interesting side note, Edward II wasn't well liked either. In 1327, his own wife mounted a campaign against him and forced him to abdicate in favour of their son. He was captured and taken to Berkeley Castle, where he was tortured and murdered, and the history rumour mill has it, finished off with a hot poker up his bottom.
That's it for our trip to the northern seaside town, but as always you can visit the places we've covered and hear even more dark stories from Liah on her Black Widow tour. All the links can be found in the show notes below. And if you do visit Scarborough, and perhaps to escape the seagulls on the seafront, you duck into Quay Street, watch out for the sound of ghostly hooves, or even a headless lady. That's it for now, but you can follow the show on Instagram as well, at Eerie Excursions. And to be sure you don't miss out on an excursion, subscribe to the YouTube channel below. For our next adventure, we'll be heading up to Scotland, to Edinburgh.
I was painting downstairs. There's a set of doors that go to the venue next door. When we walk in our entrance corridor, and they're black doors. So if I'm doing, I'll repaint them black just to give them a new coat of paint. So I was doing that. I was painting, and I heard kids laughing. It wasn't a sound like that sounds like kids laughing. It was, that's kids laughing. And now I was working overnight, so I knew it was late.
See you next time for another adventure into the darkness.